G'day everyone, welcome to our webinar for today, What to Do with More Than One Culture. Thanks so much for joining us. Now before we get into everything that we're going to be discussing today, I just want to quickly thank our sponsor who's behind the Geneva Push webinar, EA Insurance. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of your church plant at the moment, you know, everything from looking after your people to looking after your place, we highly recommend you start with a chat with EA Insurance. So go to eainsurance.com.au. Now, if this is your first time with us at the planter sessions, or you're a regular, here's some quick tips for how to maximize your experience of the webinar today. You'll be seeing at the moment on your screen a video feed, and you'll be seeing all of our special guests today and also our interviewer, Scott Sanders. To make your video feed bigger, just click on the panel and expand and contract, all that kind of thing, to see this lovely, handsome, smiling faces of our guest presenters today. Now, if you want to also interact with us today, you can ask your questions of our guests throughout the webinar, and we'll be having a special time of questions in about half an hour, 40 minutes time after some initial questions after we go through some initial questions. Now, to send them through, please send them through to me via your chat window. You'll see as part of the menu of the webinar, so there's a window that says chat. Click on that and then send your questions through to the host. That's me, Ben. Don't send your questions directly to Scott. He's doing all kinds of other things as he goes through the webinar. Send them directly to me, and if we have enough time, we'll be able to, we'll try to get to those questions throughout the webinar today. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm going to hand over now to Scott Sanders, the Executive Director of Geneva Push, who's going to guide us through what to do with more than one culture. Scott?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be looking at such an important topic today. I just wanted to set the scene. It's a reality in Australia that we're a multicultural nation. If you look at the ABS data, the growth projections are always sort of moving out. You know, it used to be 2050 a few years ago. Now the statisticians are looking at the population in 2061. It looks like in Australia we'll have close to 41.5 million people, and 8.5 million will be living in Sydney and in Melbourne. So there's always that question about who's going to be the largest city. What's interesting though is net overseas migration is going to contribute about 17.3 million people. So that's not only migrants themselves coming to Australia, but that's also children born to migrants. And in terms of total population, percentage-wise, it's going to be 41.6% of the total population. So the reality is that we live in a multicultural nation. It's something that we celebrate regularly. My kids have just celebrated Orange Day on, I think it was Easter Hat Parade, and as well as Grandparents' Day, they celebrated Harmony Day as a school, wore orange as a sign of the number of cultures that make up our school population. What's interesting in Sydney is that over 2/3 of the migrants are actually coming from Asia or the Middle East, and I think that's reflective across the nation in our various other cities. Now, one of the things that I found helpful in this discussion over the last few years, in talking with both practitioners and also missiologists, is this idea of the different generations. First generation, 1.5 generation, second generation, and third plus generation. And you can see there's a flow, or there's a desire to understand, well, how do we actually reach people in the next generation? And I'm just going to go through these slides very quickly. But in terms of understanding what a first generation migrant looks like, they migrated as adults or late high school. Their heart language or is their home language. They've got a strong migrant work study ethic, and we're going to be pressing into that today in some of the questions. And they generally don't integrate well with other cultures and Australians. Generation 1.5, they're not Australian born, but they're Australian raised. They come as young children up to early high school. They're bilingual or more. Many can read, write in their home language as well, but their heart language is English. Now, they can mix and interact well with Anglo-Australians, but they won't feel completely at home with them, yet not completely comfortable with first generation either. They're caught in that hard place, and they tend to mix with the 1.5 generation or the second generation. Well, what about the second generation? They're Australian born and raised. Their heart language is English. They may speak basic or conversational language of their home country. They still feel somewhat torn between the two cultures, and there's varying degrees of integration. It depends on where they've been brought up. Some may consider themselves fully Aussie, others may be more comfortable around other 1.5 or second generations. And then finally, there's this third plus generation. Speak English only. They're very happy to integrate with Anglo-Australians, and there's different post-multicultural Australia versus that during white Australia policy. So it's helpful to look back at third generations, 2 or 3 generations ago, and the current third generations that are there. One of the things we've just recently been talking about a lot is some Australian research that we've done into church planting. I found this slide quite challenging. It's a survey result of 110 church plants, which was a good sample size of church plants in Australia. At the moment, only 27% of congregations are intentionally seeking to reach a cross-cultural or multi-ethnic group of people from the very beginning. So I think in terms of how are we doing it, actually intentionally trying to reach other cultures, I don't think as a church in Australia we're doing very well. Well, I want to introduce our panellists today. We've got two. We've got a leading practitioner. We've got a leading missiologist in David Williams. Peter, it's great to have you here. So welcome to the webinar.
Thanks. Great to be here.
And happy birthday as well.
Thank you.
Peter's a church planter. He's a pastor among growing migrant communities in Sydney's multi-ethnic southwest. Peter, can I just hear from you? What was it like for you growing up in church?
So I am a 1.5er. So it was very interesting. I grew up from a Chinese church, Milton Point, and most of the people I grew up with that I mingled with were second generation or more, and they were very, very Aussie. Even though they have Asian faces, most of them didn't speak any Chinese, whereas I did. I spoke and read and can read and write Chinese. So I don't think I quite mixed and fit in with them. And I think I really felt that being torn between two cultures, and yet English was my heart language, so I didn't mix with the Mandarin speakers either. So I kind of grew up in limbo, really. And
in terms of church culture, it was largely a Chinese church.
It's a Chinese church, and still is. Yeah, the church I grew up in.
Yep. So you wouldn't call it a multi-ethnic church, or you'd call it a...
No, not multi-ethnic. I mean, it's basically very predominantly Chinese and Chinese diaspora, so Chinese from all over Asia,
yep.
Even places like Fiji actually. But yeah, they're mostly Chinese background, and a smattering of Anglos, often who are married to Chinese.
And so I think it's helpful in terms of there is a difference between a Singaporean and a Malaysian Chinese and an Indonesian Chinese and a...
Absolutely. So I think it's helpful to talk about sometimes to distinguish between multi-ethnic and multicultural.
Yep.
Because within the one ethnicity of, say, even Chinese, and you can even subdivide the ethnicities, but just broadly, within Chinese, there's a stack of different cultures because they're so different to each other. So we even in a Chinese church, you have a lot of cultural tensions, not just generational, but based on where they're from.
Yep. That's really helpful. And your current church has 3 congregations, and you can see from the slide here, very I guess very different approach to who they're trying to reach. Just you can see that I guess in the logos and the badging of each of the services.
So we started out as a Chinese church, and we're trying to, and you'll hear from David in a moment when he defines multi-ethnic, and we're not quite there yet, but we want to reach migrant ethnic groups that are not Chinese, and Bankstown is the first congregation beginning to do that.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about Southwest Chinese Christian Church. Welcome, David. It's not your birthday today, but it's great to have you here with us.
Thanks, Scott.
Now, David, you head up CMS's training school down in Melbourne in St Andrews, and obviously you're not from here either. Tell us where did you grow up?
So I'm originally from the UK. I was a doctor. I worked in the health service in the UK, and then local church ministry, and then we spent 9 years in Kenya with a British agency called Crosslinks, where I was principal of an Anglican college that was training people for mission and evangelism from across East Africa.
Now, you hear often in the literature this idea of being a third culture person. Is that how you describe yourself?
I think it's probably who I'm becoming, but it's certainly who my children would identify as being third culture children, TCK, third culture kids. And I think that's that idea of a third culture. Essentially, what that is saying is that, so for my children, born in England, did their growing up in Kenya and now living in Australia, they don't feel that they belong in any one of those three places particularly, but they belong in this sort of slightly amorphous third culture where they identify with people who've had similar varied experiences. And I think one of the interesting things I've learned in the last few years at St Andrew's Hall is we've had a number of Australian-born Chinese through, and people from different cultural backgrounds, is they identify very strongly with that sense of being third culture people and not quite belonging anywhere.
Do you think we talk lots about the global world and obviously the internet and the ability to patch someone in from around the world, the growing wealth that we have, we're able to travel the world. Are we becoming more more open to other cultures just generally as a world, or are we still pretty, I guess, racist, ethnically driven, blinkered in how we view ourselves and how we view others? Have you got some insights into that?
Well, I think both of those narratives are playing out at the same time alongside each other. So there's a narrative of valuing multiculturalism, valuing globalism, seeing it as a great and a wonderful thing, and alongside that would be the narrative of wanting to embrace people from other cultures and embrace migrants and all of that kind of thing. I'm using Miroslav Volf's language. Then you've got a separate narrative, which is the narrative of exclusion, and that's the language we're hearing from Donald Trump. Keep people out, they're dangerous, build a wall, and as fear grows, the language of exclusion starts overcoming the language of embracing people. So I think we're living in very interesting times.
Yeah, excellent. And I reckon what we're looking at today is going to help us think into that a bit more. Now, David, I want you to kick us off in our time. Can you define for us multi-ethnic church?
Sure. So I'm going to use, I'm just using a definition that comes from probably the most significant Christian anthropologist, a guy called Paul Hebert. So he defines a multi-ethnic church as a church in which there's an attitude and practice of accepting people of all ethnic, class and national origins as equal and fully participating members and ministers in the fellowship of the church, and the manifestation of this attitude and practice by the involvement of people from different ethnic, social and national communities as members of the church. That's a bit long-winded. Maybe a briefer version of the same thing would be to say that a multi-ethnic church is striving to be as culturally and socially diverse as the local setting in which it's found. So if you're in Lakemba, you will strive to be as ethnically diverse as Lakemba is, and that will mean engaging with Lebanese. If you're in a different suburb, that social and cultural diversity might mean that you're striving to be more engaged with blue collar, or later we've got some questions about benefits culture, people who are living on benefits. So you're not trying to be multi-ethnic beyond the focus of your local community. And I think that thing about striving is quite significant. You can strive to be engaged with the local Somali community, but historically Somalis have been very difficult to reach with the gospel, so you shouldn't be beating yourself up if there aren't many Somalis actually in church.
Yep, and it's interesting, he divides it between ethnic, social and national communities. What does he mean by national communities?
Yeah, so I think that's just reflecting different makeups of people. So ethnicity and nationality aren't quite the same thing. So I'm ethnically Caucasian. Nationality-wise, I've got 2 citizenships in Australia and the UK. So, I think that's a feature that when you start looking at things like 1.5, 2.0 generation, your ethnicity starts making a difference on that. So if you came to Australia and you were ethnically Caucasian, if you're generation 2 or generation 3, you kind of look Anglo, whereas if you're ethnically Chinese, you might feel completely Australian, but people will still say to you in the street, oh, you're Chinese, because ethnically you look Chinese. So different people have different experiences. In the kind of anthropological and post-colonial world, that language of third space and third space theory starts coming through, and recognizing that people are a hybrid of their unique kind of affinities. So your identity comes from a hybridity of experiences that actually is going to be different for different people. And everyone's story in this is going to be a little bit different.
Excellent. Can you tell us then, if we understand, we've sort of set the scene, this is multi-ethnic church, can you tell us then about the homogeneous unit principle, and I guess share some of the why of this approach?
So the homogeneous unit principle is pretty much the opposite of multi-ethnic church. So multi-ethnic church is saying that you should strive to be, your church community should strive to be as ethnically diverse as the community that you're based in. The homogeneous or homogeneous unit principle is saying that the most effective way to grow a church, or the quickest way to grow a church, would be in Lakemba to start a Lebanese church or an Arabic language church, then a separate maybe Chinese church, and a separate, so you focus on a homogeneous unit. Now, so the people behind the homogeneous unit principle, really the fathers of the church growth movement, so Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner. And essentially what McGavran was doing was making an observation. And the observation turned into what is called the homogeneous unit principle. The observation was simply this, that people like to become Christians without crossing racial, linguistic, or class barriers. And his observation became a principle, and their principle was that if you want to grow the church quickly, and he was very focused on the speed of growth as quite a driving principle behind what he was thinking. So what he argued was, if you focus on one particular language, racial group, you don't require people to cross those groups. People prefer to become Christians in that kind of context. Now, one of the things we need to think about in engaging with all of this is that he was writing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and part of what he was reacting to was missiologically an extractionist model of mission, where people were being pulled out of their communities into Western-style mission compounds. So he was particularly McGavran worked in India, and the model that he was reacting against was a kind of mission station that included church, hospital, school, and when people became Christians, they got pulled out of their communities into this new kind of missionary community. And he was saying, let's stop extracting people from their communities, let's reach them within their community and respect their language. But in his seminal book, Understanding Church Growth, he actually says, I'm not sure that this is necessarily true for urban contexts. Now, Wagner would go on and argue that it was. And what Wagner did was to try to find a biblical justification for the homogeneous unit principle. My view would be that the biblical justification that they came up with is exegetically fairly tenuous. But I think that there are reasons, that there are things within the HUP that are undeniably true, but maybe for different reasons than the reasons that McGavran and Wagner argued. And I think the particularly significant thing is around language. I think one of the things that's distinctive about Christianity, particularly as compared to Islam, is that we believe that God speaks every language and that you can relate to our God, the triune God, in your own language. You don't have to learn Greek or Hebrew or English, or if you're a Muslim, you don't have to learn Arabic. And I think one of the things that McGavran hits on is that actually people are more likely to respond to the gospel if they hear it in their heart language. And so I think one of the tensions for multi-ethnic church is then the tension around what language you operate in. Because undoubtedly, if people hear the gospel in their heart language and are discipled in their heart language, it is easier for them to respond and to be disciples.
It's interesting hearing you talk about it, David. It's all coming out of a desire to actually reach people with the gospel and understand where they're at. Actually, the sentness, I guess, of the New Testament and the language of Jesus, and understanding, the importance of reaching them in their own heart language so they can actually hear the gospel and respond. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, so when I'm critiquing particularly Wagner's biblical defense of HUP, I mean, he argues that in Acts, the apostles evangelized Jews and Gentiles separately and then intentionally kept them apart as separate homogeneous units and tried to intentionally keep them separate, and he then said that's a biblical principle. I think that pretty much flies in the face of what Paul argues the cross is capable of doing between Jew and Gentile as breaking down the barrier, dividing wall of hostility.
Ephesians 2, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I bring Peter in? I think where does your church fit in to these two models of the homogeneous unit principle and the multi-ethnic church?
We're very, very deliberately seeking to be a multi-ethnic church.
Yep.
So when it comes to intention and desire, that's where we're heading towards. So we've come from a homogeneous unit church, being planted from a Chinese church, and really being planted to reach the large swaths of Chinese people in the South and Southwest. But we're seeing our ability to actually cross into different cultures, particularly ones that are only about half an ethnic step away.
Mm-hmm.
And we just want to make those crossings one at a time. And so part of our Bankstown church plant strategy is to locate ourselves where Chinese are a significant ethnic group, but not the majority. And we're working very hard at crossing firstly into the Vietnamese ethnic group, and we're doing that with quite a lot of success. But we want to be more reflective of Bankstown, and that has big Arabic populations and islanders and other ethnicities. So it's for us a step-by-step sort of thing, and we operate as sort of a hub model of a church. So whereas one congregation may not reflect all the ethnicities that we would like to, we would hope that in the future we'd have lots of different things under our big umbrella that would be able to bring people together across different ethnicities and different cultures within those ethnicities.
So Peter, has it just been a pragmatic approach, just the reality of actually trying to reach out to these different ethnicities, or has there been a theological driver for trying to reach out to, and become a multi-ethnic church?
Yeah, it's definitely theologically. Like I think I grew up. In Sydney, I think HUP was almost the standard model of doing church and trying to grow churches for a lot of the 80s and 90s, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not just along ethnic lines, it was along other subcultural lines. So, every church wanted to have an evening service that was aimed at young adults or youth. I mean, that's a form of HUP if you want to think about it. We want to reach a particular group, second generation even, we'll start a Greek church or a Chinese church or an Australian-born Chinese church. That was the milieu of growing up in church circles in the 80s and 90s. But I think progressively we just see that it was harder and harder to justify biblically. And you begin to see that where language is not an issue, it becomes an unhealthy way of doing church. So just your classic, again, not along ethnic lines, but your classic youth service mentality. Yep. Actually, in the long run, we find almost every church that has a thriving youth service in the evening finds it really hard to disciple them past their age group. And you lose large swaths of them, not just because they're moving away when they grow up and have their own families, but they're not integrating back into the family services. So I think we see that there's a lack of discipleship and that's certainly the case with other HUP model ministries. So that I think theologically, that's where I've been convinced by. What does drive us pragmatically is the speed at which we do that. We're not embarrassed by the fact that God has brought us up in a particular tradition of particular ethnicities, and we are good at reaching certain people, and we will leverage who we are to take half steps towards other cultures that other churches might find harder to take. So I'm still convinced that migrant communities are the best people to reach other migrant communities, even if they have nothing in common, just purely by the fact that they're migrant and minorities. So I think it's easier for a group of Asians to reach non-Asians who are also migrants than perhaps for your average Anglo church to reach them sometimes. And we want to leverage off that strength, which actually does mean perhaps that we do a bit of a kind of piecemeal approach and how we grow our multi-ethnicity. That has its limitations as well, because you reach a certain critical mass and it's hard to turn things around. But we're working at how to do that in the best way that we can, given who we are.
Now, it's helpful. You've been put in a time and a place, and God has been really helpful. It's been great seeing the history of Acts 11 of Southwest China's Christian Church, grow over the last few years. And I'm praying, I guess, with you and the core team that not only Viets are reached, but also Lebanese and Arabic. The Arabic community in Bankstown is also reached. David, can I bring you back in again for the conversation? Why in more recent time has the HUP been, I guess, so criticised? Given, especially in light of the fact that it has been successful, I guess, in reaching out to first generation, migrant communities, or socially class-like areas as well. So why has there been pushback on the homogenous unit principle in the literature and also in the church world?
Yeah, the missiologist joke is that the homogenous unit principle is great in practice but not in theory. And I think as it's borne increasing scrutiny as a principle, the biblical basis for it, and particularly the way that Wagner argued it, I think is extremely questionable, with some pretty unhelpful exegesis, frankly. That's at the theoretical level. At the more practical level, I think the issue has been that HUP is often a great way to start, but over time people have found that it's been difficult to transition from HUP into a more multi-ethnic church. And McGavran, to be fair to him, I don't think envisaged HUP as the ending point, but as the starting point. So when he was writing, he was saying start HUP and then become more like perhaps the Ephesians 2 model, a multi-ethnic model. Yep. I think as time has passed, the experience has been that actually that transition from homogenous to multi-ethnic has actually been very difficult to do for a whole number of reasons. Now, I don't know whether that's been researched, and Peter might know more about that than me, but I think the problem is that it becomes comfortable. It's easy. It's easy to mix with people who are like you, and it's uncomfortable to mix with people who are different to you. And so it's easy for a homogenous unit to get kind of set in its ways and just not to welcome those who are different or outsiders or whatever.
And there's a reality. I mean, there's a reality, David. There is a majority culture. That's how I've heard some understand it. There will be a majority culture in the church. So, I mean, even in multi-ethnic Sydney or Melbourne, I would think there would still be predominantly Anglos in the church. 50 or 60%. Even having a church as high as 45% or 40% ethnic or multi-ethnic. The majority culture still seems to, I guess, stand up, be counted, push into the other cultures. How do you? I guess one of the questions: how do you push against that? Yeah.
Well, I think that's right, and I think there are in Australia two different kinds of majority culture. There's a majority Anglo culture or a majority Chinese culture. So there are lots of churches that are majority more ethnically Chinese, whether that's Australian-born Chinese or mainland Chinese. I think both the predominantly Anglo and the predominantly Chinese both find it equally difficult to be kind of inclusive and to change their demographic. I think part of the issue is that many churches simply don't know who is in their neighbourhood. So we define multi-ethnic as striving to be as diverse as the location that you're in. Many churches just haven't done the demographic study to find out the diversity of the location that they're in. So don't even know what they're aiming at. They're not sure who's on their patch. They're not sure who they should be reaching. I think there are some exceptions to that. I think churches all around Australia are finding that Persians are walking in through the door and trying to find Jesus. God seems to be doing remarkable things with Iranians, and we praise God for that. But other Muslim background groups are much harder to reach with the gospel. I think we have to be much more intentional. Persians just seem to be particularly kind of reacting against their experience of Shiite Islam in Iran and seeking for something different to that.
So there, again, that's that sort of time and place question that we're in at the moment, where Iranians are more open to the gospel. Peter, can I get you to weigh in, and can I encourage people to send through their questions? Open up the chat icon, email you, or send your questions to Ben. I want to bring Peter back in on the discussion. How have you practically dealt with the conflicting cultures? Can you tell us a bit more about SWCC's approach?
Yeah, we do multilingual, well, 2 languages, because we, with the Chinese heart language, it becomes very important in terms of our planting philosophy. So we've, from the outset, have had first and then second generation ministries happening alongside. I find that the cultural conflict has been actually more along within the ethnic Chinese. There's actually quite a lot between the generations, and I think any church is trying to reach the whole family with first and second generation languages will find that the conflicts are stronger there. We found the conflicts amongst the English-speaking cultures, the ones that are represented, far less, because I think once you hit the second generation and people who are willing to integrate at different levels, there's a lot more in common. But look, the simple answer is, how do we deal with it? Is with great patience and with great difficulty, because all sorts of cultural things come up, and we're talking about different cultures within this, within largely the same ethnicity. It helps that we have a staff team that is represented across the different groupings that we're talking about, where the conflicts. So so within our staff team, we've got first generation, one and a half, as well as second generation. Yep. And it's a lot easier to manage when your church is led by people who share the same vision of unity and are mature enough to help the conflicts not blow out into major church splits, which a lot of ethnic churches have been known to have. Most ethnic churches multiply by splits, not by church planting. And thankfully, we haven't had any of those big ones. It's the same kind of conflict and the same kind of way that you deal with cultural conflicts outside of the church. You just have to apply within the church as well, just with a lot more grace and patience. But it's certainly there. Yeah. So
you've spoken about having a multi-ethnic team and a multi-generational team as well. How important is to actually meet together, as a whole church family? Is that something that you do, and have done as a church now that you're three locations or 3 congregations in one church?
Yeah, it's harder. It's harder across the languages, but at least twice a year we do services with translation.
Yep.
And that's usually the Christmas and Easter period. The staff team meet together weekly, and I think that's really important. I think the unity of the staff team, the unity of our lay leaders, especially at the top level, the elders, we meet together monthly. So that becomes vital because I think if it's unified at the top and there's no misunderstandings and cultural conflicts, unnecessary cultural conflicts at the top, it tends to stabilize what goes on the grassroots.
Yep.
But I also don't want to force too many. I mean, I don't know if you've ever sat through a bilingual service. It's pretty tedious, and so we want to make sure that when we do it well. We do the translations very slick and very and we try and make it as good as possible for all those involved. But we don't do that very, very often. Where some churches want to do that more often, but we also believe that it's not just a matter of jamming people together. We want real relationships to be formed. And the good thing we've got combined youth and children's ministries, and that tends, and other kind of community outreach events. In the past, we've had things like play groups and and ESL teaching, and that tends to unite people as well. So we want it to be a little bit organic as well.
So Jonathan's asked this question about South Asian Christian leaders who require that as leaders they be followed first. How do you deal with I guess different leadership cultures and the expectations that they have? Like I'm thinking particularly of Asian culture, and Jonathan sounds like Jonathan's thinking of Asian culture where elders are honoured, and there'll be an expectation that you listen to the seniority, to the leader. You don't challenge that. I'm thinking as an Anglo, that's very different to my culture and upbringing. You always question, you always ask why. You don't just follow blindly. How do you deal with the cultural implications of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to recognise, we always have our cultural glasses on. But then the second thing is we want to be churches that are constantly critiquing everything that we have culturally or otherwise by the gospel and by what the Bible says. So I don't want to say, okay, I want to be sensitive to culture, but yet I want to say, look, there are some unbiblical things about the Asian or even the South Asian view of leadership and what makes a leader and how much they can or cannot be questioned. We might want to question, for example, raise up issues in a more culturally sensitive way, but I don't want to leave the cultural presuppositions, especially ones that are unbiblical or unhelpful. I don't want to leave them untouched. So we want to be educating our people, and again, that begins at the top. So we will decide which battles that we're going to fight as a staff team. Do you know what I mean? Like, if in the process of educating our elders as to what leadership looks like, and our congregation members as to what following the leader looks like in a way that's more biblical rather than just culturally aligned, in an unbiblical way, that we'll sometimes decide, okay, that's worth fighting for, that's worth teaching on, that's worth having a sit-down long session about. Other times we'll think, well, probably at this stage of our church, it's not the battle we'll fight, and so we'll work out a way of compromising. And I think that's a wisdom call at the moment, but I think the general principle is we don't want to leave cultural assumptions about anything unchallenged by the Bible. Now, our own culture included.
Now, practically, how do you do that? Is that through your preaching program? How are you addressing and raising those cultural questions? And I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear from David first, and then come back to Peter. Because David, I guess you can talk to us about African cultures. I can still remember being in a Bible study group with some Sudanese leaders, and they approached one of my members and asked them to be their second wife. How do you deal with a different culture and then bring the Bible to bear, and also deal with your own presuppositions and issues?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we need to do if we're engaged in multi-ethnic ministry is we need to have some kind of framework in our minds as leaders and as a staff team for understanding and analysing culture. And there are lots of frameworks out there. They've been well written up. I won't kind of go into those, but things like the Hofstadter analysis or Lingenfelter and Mayer's, those kinds of things. just having a cultural grid that allows us to make a cultural analysis of issues that are going on. So for one of those grids would include things like power distance, whether you're a hierarchical or a non-hierarchical culture, whether you're a high context or a low context culture, those kinds of differences. And I think one of the lessons that we're constantly trying to drum into people here at St Andrew's Hall is to encourage them to constantly try to suspend judgment and not to assume that something is in the sinful, not sinful category before they've analysed whether it might be in the cultural category. So going back to the example of leadership, more hierarchical cultures with a bigger power distance expect a leader to be more respected and honoured and not to be questioned by people who are kind of lower down in the system, as it were. Now, someone from that perspective, that kind of a more hierarchical leader, will argue that that's biblical. The Bible says you should respect your leaders and honour them. And so they will argue that they're being biblical and that an Anglo-Australian leadership style with a very flat structure where you can approach a leader directly and challenge and question them, they will argue that that is actually unbiblical.
Yep.
So before you kind of hurry into a conversation about whether something is sinful, not sinful, I think it's really important to try to suspend judgment and try to analyse some of the cultural issues that are going on. And so having a grid, a cultural analytical grid that you can run that through is really important.
So Pete Woods asked the question, you know, reflecting on that, I guess a little bit further is on the shame cultures. You know, how do you deal with upset, offended people in shame cultures? How do you confront issues of sin then in shame cultures? So
yeah. That's a classic kind of question and an issue that we have to deal with, and I think that's quite difficult to resolve. Typically, in more shame-oriented cultures, the way that those kinds of conflicts are resolved is more indirectly. So culturally, you wouldn't approach someone directly and challenge them. You might find a more indirect method of engaging with that issue. So culturally, that might look like using a mediator. So instead of a leader going directly to someone, they might speak to a third party and ask the third party to go and talk it through with the person. Now, then you have to think through, is that a cultural thing that actually the Bible overrules with, you know, Matthew 18, Jesus says, if you have an issue with your brother, go to him directly? Or is using a mediator and a culturally appropriate, biblically faithful contextualization of that principle? You know, conservative evangelicals in mission would sort of differ on how you answer that question.
That's one approach. Peter, can you weigh in on some more practical help? I guess a solution comes from Ben, or at least they're asking the question in regards to issues of the homogeneous principle. Is it a helpful model to have HUP Bible study groups, so ethnically similar Bible study groups, and then have multi-ethnic gatherings? Does that give us the best of both worlds? They've asked. Yeah, David and Peter, do you have some comments on that as an approach?
Can I just backtrack on the on Pete Woods' questions? I think the way that David outlined it has been helpful. I think in the kind of context we're in, where first generation people with the honor shame theme, we found that to go in very strongly with well, this is the only right way of resolving conflict, is the direct approach, can be quite disastrous and unhelpful.
Yep.
And actually being more sensitive about sometimes the mediator approach, that's really working against the way I've been raised. But it helps to have staff team members who are first generation. You kind of check things with them and you say, how would you take this? You know, putting yourself in that position. And we found that with our first generation congregation, it's quite important to think about other ways of approaching conflict resolution and pointing out sin, and it can actually be much more effective. And I think you can actually do it in such a way that you're not contravening the Bible's teaching about, not gossiping and all that. I mean, you can keep confidence. I think you can. I would want to argue you can do it while preserving the spirit of Matthew 18, and particularly thinking about how to love and care for someone in a different culture. So anyway, that's just my reflections on how it's worked out in our context. Maybe David want to tackle the question you've just raised first, and I'll come back and think about it. Yeah,
so David, is an approach to have ethnically similar Bible study groups and then gather together, as a multi-ethnic church. Does that get the best of both worlds? Have you got some thoughts on that?
I think it's an option. If we go down it all depends how you define church, doesn't it? If church is just a gathering, then in a sense both are both gatherings of believers. I think I would probably just be a bit more pragmatic and say that the issue of language is very significant, and so finding ways to disciple people in their heart language, I think, enables them to respond faithfully to the gospel. And if that means that you need to have one small group that is Arabic language based, if you have the privilege of someone who can disciple in Arabic, that's going to enable Arabic speakers to follow Jesus faithfully in a much more effective way than if they're not operating in their heart language. I think I would say that the ideal, though, would be often the culture of your small groups creates the culture of your church. So if your small groups are all culturally monochrome, the risk is that when they gather for the Sunday gathering, that they don't know how to integrate with each other. So enabling people to do multi-ethnic life alongside each other, I think I would argue if you want to be truly effective as a multi-ethnic gathering of believers, you would need to drive that all the way down into your small group system, but with that sort of caveat that I don't think that principle wants to become too controlling, because I think the thing of language is very significant.
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, some of the things I've seen when I've been part of like a college community with number of diversity in the singles quarters was just praying. So we all study the Bible in English, but then there's freedom to pray in your heart language, or there's freedom to break up into smaller language groups so that you do have that freedom to, I guess, express your heart language in prayer. But I hear what you're saying. It's helpful to what you want to see in the larger gathering, you want to see taking place in the smaller gatherings. We've got another great question just from the audience. So a question from Mike, talking again about majority culture, and I guess the risk or the reality sometimes that some groups break away and create those cliques that you're talking about, create those, where it is just more comfortable to eat together, to language together. Often you see churches that have the English-speaking congregation, they'll have the Korean or the Chinese or the Indonesian congregation, and then they'll have a young adults congregation in the evening, and none of them ever mix. How do we move that towards a multi-ethnic dynamic, realising that language is a barrier, realising that, ethnicity and culture is something that will divide us? Do we encourage it, or do we, again, move towards a multi-ethnic church? Peter, David, thoughts?
I think it's important to recognise that church size plays a big role, congregation size. I mean, there's just sociological, dynamic type considerations. When a church is 80 to 100 or bigger, you'll find that people will get into cliques around their cultural, comfortable groupings anyway.
Yep.
And this is not even talking about across ethnicities. It's just talking about, young people hanging around with young people and all, So I think we just got to recognise that. And in some ways, the ethnic question is a subset of the how do you get people just to look out for each other and to see that discipleship has got to work across generations and across cultural groups, subcultural groups, even within, say, an ethnically homogeneous congregation.
Yep.
I think that there's more considerations when ethnicity is at play. Certainly, when language is at play, is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
But I think so we're a church of 30 people and has got a smattering of different types of ethnicities as well as different groups. You'll find that people will mingle just much more naturally, especially if it's a church plant and everyone has got the kind of welcoming DNA. I think it always gets harder when you're, upwards of 100 or more. So I think that's probably the first thing to consider, and you've got to push people towards that at the same time recognizing the limitations just because you're larger. And I think here's where your small groups can actually play a part. In a larger church setting, you almost want to work even more proactively in mingling the groups, because that's where people are able to do life on a smaller scale. And so if the groups are homogeneous, I totally agree with David, then your church is going to just bunch up in cliques on a Sunday. Whereas if you can somehow bridge generations as well as subcultural groups and ethnic groups, as long as language is not an issue, during the week in smaller groups of 10, 12 people, then I think you're going to find more success. And it may be that you rejig groups every year. I mean, some churches are very precious about groups remaining there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but actually mixing everyone around, I mean that unsettles people, but it increases the kind of exposure to other groups. That may be a strategy in order to encourage larger churches to have the mingling involved. But language, I think, is probably the greatest barrier, and that's the one that, I think you'll just have to realize that will tend to be a barrier.
David, do you have any insights?
I'd agree with Peter. I think that's very helpful. I mean, I think one observation would be that when you start getting into second generation, so in the scenario you painted of congregations, maybe a Korean congregation and a Chinese congregation, an Indonesian congregation, at the first generation level, they'll be very different. But the second generation Koreans, the second generation Chinese, the second generation Indonesians, they'll all have actually a lot in common with each other.
Yep.
They'll have a lot of shared experience as growing up in families of first generation people that I think we ought to expect would draw them together. There'll be a commonality there that ought to, I think we ought to expect that they would, and the language issues are no longer in play at that point. So trying to pull people together at second generation, even 1.5 generation, when the language issues aren't such a big deal, I think that's, and I think I would expect that, and I think I've observed here in Melbourne that commonality happens. So second generation Korean and second generation Chinese, they've got a lot to talk about.
Yep. We got another question that's really helpful and very practical. How do we deal? Pete asked this question. How do you deal with people in your church who actually see a multi-ethnic church as a problem? They actually see having many different cultures in their church as problematic. How would you deal with that?
Well, I think I'd want to know to start with whether that attitude is coming from an inherent racism, just an Anglo racism that's almost a carryover of a kind of white Australia policy thinking. If it's about that, or whether it's being driven by someone who's very persuaded theologically that HUP is the way to go. Those would be very different motivations for that concern. So if it's an issue of racism, I think it just needs to be challenged pretty head on.
Yep.
And people need to be discipled and taught scripture on that issue. If it's for other reasons, you might need to take you might need to teach into that in a slightly different way.
Pete, yeah, I mean, can you helpfully talk about instances of that in your church where the gospel has changed and and transformed people, and how you've approached that, where I guess people have it's racism, underlying racism that's caused that view?
Yeah, I mean, growing up in an ethnic church, you realise that probably the most racist people are ethnic people, especially Chinese people. I think for ethnic groups who are racist, time works against the racism, because one day their children might marry an Anglo or an African, and that's great. I'd love to see that happen, because then you can say, okay, well, you working that out. I think harder is the kind of carryover white Australia type attitude. You don't see it much in the city, although I have come across it, even at church recently where I was talking to a brother who and the interesting thing is he's actually married to a Chinese lady, but I think there's actually quite a lot of racism. Yeah. That's quite hard, because I think we haven't had to deal with that so much in our context, because the Anglos who are part of our church tend to be very, very happy to be in the minority at times. Yep. So I don't know. I think you'd have to talk to someone who has had to face that in an Anglo context, where they're trying to grow, say, an international ministry, how you do that. And I know some church planners or church pastors who've had to face that one, and that's not an easy one to turn around, especially when it's a generational thing as well.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's, again, looking at your demographics, your community. Often I think it's an older generation problem, although I don't want to be blind to say that it's not in our younger generation as well. But you can address the fears, you can address what's underlying it.
I think that's it. I think it's recognizing and hearing their fears, because I think that's often what's driving it. I mean, our xenophobia, especially towards Muslims in Australian society, it's driven by fear. And we don't actually recognize that actually the most fearful people in Australia at the moment are Muslims, because they're so fearful of reprisal and how, and we just don't hear each other's fears. And I think trying to get underneath the reaction to the fears can actually be a better solution than trying to hit it head on.
Now, David, I've heard you speak about the importance of talking about the identity, our identity in Christ, and how that is a helpful practical way to teach on that regularly. How do you, we can believe it as a theological reality, but how do you, how would you approach that? How would you teach on that? Do you teach on that regularly if you see that issue?
Well, I've taught on this in a number of ways. Just one example would be Genesis 12. God calls Abraham to leave his family, his kindred, his father's house and his land, and culturally those would have been the things that defined him, that were identity defining, and he's given those things back as a new identity defined by grace. So I think Abraham shows us what it means to become someone whose identity is redefined by a gift of God's grace. And so I think what we then need to do in our church families is to find ways of modelling what it means to define our identity by who God's made us, rather than where we've come from ethnically or geographically or those kinds of things. What that means is that, we ought to be challenging our church families that people who are ethnically different but Christians owe greater allegiance to one another than to people who are ethnically the same and not Christian.
Yep.
Now, that's going to be a very challenging thing, particularly for some minority groups to hear. But I think unarguably that is the Bible's view, that our relationship to Jesus now defines our family, it defines our ethnicity. We're the Jesus tribe. I've used that language in Africa a bit. We're the Jesus tribe. That's the tribe that we belong to. And trying to teach into that, enable people to reflect on what that means. And I think part of the problem with attitudes of racism often is that people who have those attitudes just have never really related to people who are different from them. So they've never had that opportunity to discover that someone who looks different to me and thinks different to me is actually my brother or sister in Christ. Yep. And when they make that discovery, they go, oh, actually, this isn't so hard.
Well, that's a really helpful, it's a really encouraging point to finish off about identity in Christ and how that should shape us as a Christian community. I just want to thank David and Peter this morning. It's been really helpful hearing your insights and for your openness and sharing your experience. I will probably come back to you after this interview with just some book recommendations and some other resources that you think will be helpful just to push us. And one of the key questions that came up in this was, how do you reach a benefits culture, or how do we reach a welfare, lower socioeconomic areas? And so we're thinking about doing another planter session on that, in the next 12 to 18 months. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ben and just thank David and Peter again. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks so much, guys, for all of your great insights and wisdom on the practical and the theological fronts this morning on what to do with more than one culture. Now, before we sign off, just want to point you towards a huge event that's coming along in May. If you haven't already registered for Multiply 16, you should do it right now. Geneva's national conference happens every year. It's going on May 16 to May 18 on the topic of the invisible war, inspiring the spiritual battle and the growing church. We're going to hear from Andrew Hurd across those couple of days. He's going to unpack the spiritual conflicts in which we find ourselves and how this applies to breaking new ground for God. So go to genevapush.com and register right now for Multiply 16. It's coming up very soon on May 16 to May 18. That's our national conference. Well, also before we sign off, just two quick things to mention. The first is thanks again to the sponsor of our webinar, EA Insurance. They get behind the planner sessions every month, and we're most grateful for that support. And finally, just when I do sign off from today's webinar, you'll be sent very quickly to a brief feedback page, and that's there just so you can help us make these webinars even better. I've been Ben McKecken on behalf of Geneva Push. Have a fantastic day.